The morning fog rolled thick across the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, wrapping around the dense forest like a shroud. It was March 1968, and 23-year-old James Cooper sat on the porch of his grandfather's cabin, cleaning an old hunting rifle that had been in his family for 3 generations. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use, the barrel still gleaming despite its age. James had grown up in these woods. Every tree, every deer trail, every hidden creek was etched into his memory like a map only he could read. His grandfather, Thomas Cooper, a World War II veteran who never spoke much about the war, had taught him everything about survival, tracking, and most importantly, patience. The old man would say that the forest teaches you to become invisible if you learn to listen. But James wasn't thinking about hunting deer that morning. The draft letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, crisp and official, telling him he'd be shipping out to Vietnam in 30 days. His mother had cried. His father had simply nodded, that same stoic expression he always wore. His grandfather had taken him aside that evening and said something that stuck with him. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. They forget that in their fancy training camps. James reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training with a duffel bag and a heart full of uncertainty. The drill sergeants barked orders. The obstacles seemed endless, and the heat was suffocating. But when they moved to marksmanship training, something shifted. James had been shooting since he was 6 years old. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 200 yards, James was landing perfect shots at 500. Sergeant Miller, a grizzled combat veteran with a scar running down his left cheek, noticed immediately. After the 3rd perfect score in a row, Miller pulled James aside. "You grew up hunting, didn't you, Cooper?" "Yes, Sergeant. West Virginia mountains." Miller studied him for a long moment. "I'm recommending you for sniper school. You've got something most of these boys don't. Natural instinct. Don't waste it." 6 weeks later, James found himself at sniper school, learning the technical side of long-range shooting, wind calculation, ballistics, and tactical positioning. But what set him apart wasn't just his shooting. It was his ability to disappear. During field exercises, instructors would lose track of him for hours, only to discover he'd been lying 20 feet away the entire time, perfectly camouflaged. One instructor, Captain Richard Hayes, became both a mentor and a challenge. Hayes was by-the-book military, everything precise, measured, and according to doctrine. He believed in modern equipment, standard procedures, and military-approved techniques. During a training exercise, Hayes positioned the trainees in standard sniper hides, elevated positions with proper cover and concealment. James raised his hand. "Sir, permission to try something different?" Hayes frowned. "What did you have in mind, Cooper?" "There's a fallen oak about 300 yards west. Hollow inside. I could set up there. Lower profile, harder to detect." Hayes shook his head firmly. "We don't use unconventional hides, Cooper. They're unpredictable, difficult to extract from, and not in the manual. Stick to approved positions." James nodded and followed orders, but the idea gnawed at him. Back home, his grandfather had shown him how to hide inside fallen logs while hunting, becoming part of the landscape itself. Predators walked right past. Deer grazed within arm's reach. It was the ultimate camouflage. 3 months later, James landed in Vietnam. The heat hit him like a physical blow, the humidity making every breath feel thick. The jungle was unlike anything he'd experienced in West Virginia. It was alive, loud, and hostile. His unit, the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, was stationed near the DMZ, facing constant enemy contact. James's first mission as a designated marksman was textbook. He took position on a ridgeline, provided overwatch, and eliminated 3 enemy combatants who were flanking his squad. Clean, efficient, by the book. But it felt wrong. Too exposed. Too predictable. After 2 weeks in country, James started noticing patterns. The enemy knew where American snipers typically positioned themselves. They were getting smarter, using counter-snipers, spotting scopes, and flanking maneuvers. Standard doctrine was getting men killed. One evening, while his squad rested in a firebase, James approached his platoon leader, Lieutenant Davidson, a young officer fresh out of West Point with more book knowledge than field experience. "Sir, I have an idea for a new hide technique. Something unconventional." Davidson looked up from his maps. "What kind of technique?" James explained the hollow log concept, how it provided 360-degree concealment, how it eliminated the elevated silhouette that countersnipers looked for, how it allowed for sudden repositioning. Davidson listened, then shook his head slowly. "Cooper, I appreciate your initiative, but we can't have snipers freelancing out there. Command wants standardized procedures. Consistency. What you're describing sounds like it could trap you, limit your field of fire, and make extraction nearly impossible under enemy contact." James felt frustration building but kept his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, the enemy is adapting. We need to adapt too. Request denied, Cooper. Stick to approved methods. That's an order." James saluted and walked away, but something inside him had already made a decision. The old ways weren't just better. They might be the only thing that would keep him alive out here. The morning of April 15th started like any other. James's squad received orders to patrol a sector known as the Iron Triangle, an area infamous for heavy Viet Cong activity. Intelligence reported enemy movement, possible staging for an attack on a nearby firebase. As they moved through the dense jungle, James felt exposed. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound put him on edge. The standard doctrine had them moving in formation, predictable and visible to anyone watching from the shadows. Then the world exploded. The ambush came from three sides simultaneously. Machine gun fire tore through the foliage, RPG rounds detonated against trees, and James watched in horror as Private Martinez, who had been walking point, went down in the first seconds. The squad scattered, diving for cover, returning fire blindly into the jungle. Lieutenant Davidson was screaming orders, but the chaos drowned out most of his words. James found himself pressed against a fallen tree trunk, his rifle clutched tight, adrenaline making his hands shake. They were pinned down, completely surrounded. For 2 hours, the firefight continued. They called for air support, but the jungle canopy was too thick. Medevac couldn't land. 3 more men were wounded, including Davidson, who took shrapnel to his shoulder. When the enemy finally pulled back, James looked at the faces of his surviving squad members. Terror, exhaustion, and something else, resentment. They had walked straight into a trap, following procedures that the enemy had learned to exploit. That night, back at base, James couldn't sleep. Martinez was dead. 3 others were being evacuated to field hospitals. All because they had been too visible, too predictable. He found Sergeant Miller in the command tent, reviewing after-action reports. "Sergeant, we're doing this wrong." Miller looked up, his scarred face unreadable. "Careful, Cooper." James stepped closer, his voice low but intense. "They knew exactly where we'd be. They know our doctrine better than we do. Standard hides, standard formations, it's getting us killed." Miller sighed heavily. "I know what you're thinking. That log hide idea of yours. It would work, Sergeant. I know it would." Miller stood up, his expression hardening. "Command has already made their position clear, Cooper. They reviewed your proposal after Davidson reported it. They officially banned any unauthorized hide techniques. Too risky, too unconventional, and, here's the real reason, too difficult to coordinate with larger operations. You use that method, and you're facing court-martial for disobeying direct orders." James felt something break inside him. They'd rather we die following rules than live by adapting? Miller's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I didn't say I agreed with them. I said that's the order. Now, you're a good soldier, Cooper. Don't throw your career away because you think you know better than officers who've never spent a day in these jungles." James walked out of that tent a different man. The official ban wasn't just about tactics, it was about control, about maintaining a system even when that system was failing. Martinez's face haunted him. The screams of wounded men echoed in his memory. He had a choice to make, and he knew that choice might cost him everything. 2 days later, James's squad received new orders. They were to provide security for a supply convoy moving through Route 9, a stretch of road that had become a killing zone. 3 convoys had been hit in the past 2 weeks. Command needed eyes on the tree line, watching for enemy movement. Lieutenant Davidson, his shoulder bandaged but still in command, briefed the squad. Cooper, you'll take the standard elevated position on Hill 142. Overlook the entire route. Standard protocol. James nodded, but his mind was already working. Hill 142 was obvious. Too obvious. Any competent enemy would expect a sniper there and either avoid it or target it first. As the squad moved into position before dawn, James made his decision. He would follow orders partially. He'd start at Hill 142, but he'd already spotted something during their approach. A massive fallen mahogany tree about 400 yards from the road, hollow inside, with a perfect line of sight to the convoy route. He set up his rifle on Hill 142 as ordered, making sure it was visible enough that any observer would spot the position. Then, as the sun began to rise, he carefully moved down the hillside, using every bit of cover, and crawled inside the hollow log. The interior was damp and smelled of decay, but it was perfect. He carved out a small firing port, barely visible from outside, and settled in. From here, he could see the entire road without being seen. He was no longer a sniper on a hill. He was part of the jungle itself. At 0800 hours, the convoy began its movement. 6 trucks, 20 soldiers, vital medical supplies. James watched through his scope, every sense heightened. Then he saw them. 14 Viet Cong fighters moving through the jungle on the opposite side of the road, setting up for an ambush. They had RPGs, machine guns, and were positioning themselves with military precision. And just as James had predicted, 2 of them were moving toward Hill 142 countersnipers, preparing to eliminate whoever was in the standard position. James's heart pounded. If he broke radio silence now, the enemy would scatter, regroup, and hit another convoy tomorrow. But if he acted, if he engaged from this unauthorized position, he'd be confirming his disobedience. He thought of Martinez. He thought of the wounded. He thought of his grandfather's words. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. His finger moved to the trigger. The first shot dropped the enemy commander. The second took out the RPG gunner before he could fire. Chaos erupted as the Viet Cong fighters tried to locate where the shots were coming from. They looked up at Hill 142. They scanned the treeline, but they never looked down at the fallen log. If you're rooting for James right now, hoping he makes it through this, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next changes everything, and you won't want to miss how this story ends. Shots 3 through 14 came in rapid succession. The silence that followed was deafening. 14 enemy combatants lay motionless in the jungle. The convoy had passed through without a single casualty, the drivers never even knowing how close they'd come to death. James remained in the log for another 30 minutes, watching, waiting. His training had taught him patience, but his instinct told him when it was safe to move. He crawled out, covered his tracks, and made his way back to the rally point. When he arrived, Lieutenant Davidson was on the radio, his face pale. "Cooper, where the hell were you? We had reports of enemy contact, multiple hostiles down, but you weren't at your assigned position." James met his eyes steadily. "I was where I needed to be, sir." Before Davidson could respond, Sergeant Miller approached, holding a field radio. "Command wants a full debrief. Now." The debriefing room at Firebase Alpha was small and suffocating. Captain Hayes sat across from James, the same instructor who had rejected his hollow log technique back in training. Next to him was Colonel Brennan, battalion commander, a man whose reputation for strict discipline preceded him. Hayes spoke first, his voice cold. "Private Cooper, you directly disobeyed orders. You abandoned your assigned position and engaged the enemy from an unauthorized location. Do you deny this?" James kept his voice steady. "No, sir. I don't deny it." Colonel Brennan leaned forward. 14 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties. "And you did this from inside a fallen tree?" "Yes, sir." Hayes slammed his hand on the table. "This is exactly the kind of cowboy mentality that gets units killed. You could have been trapped, surrounded, killed because of your arrogance. But I wasn't, sir. The hollow log hide worked exactly as I said it would. The enemy never saw me. They couldn't predict my position because it wasn't in any manual." Brennan studied James for a long moment. "Captain Hayes has recommended disciplinary action. Court-martial for disobeying direct orders during combat operations. James felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face neutral. However, Brennan continued, his tone shifting slightly. I've been fighting in this jungle for 18 months. I've watched good men die because we're fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's tactics. The enemy adapts daily. We adapt quarterly if we're lucky. Hayes looked sharply at the colonel. Sir, with respect, if we allow soldiers to freelance. Brennan cut him off. I'm not talking about freelancing. I'm talking about survival. Cooper, explain your technique. Every detail. For the next 20 minutes, James walked them through the hollow log hide. How to select the right log, how to create firing ports, how to ensure escape routes, how to coordinate with squad movements. He pulled out a notebook where he'd sketched diagrams, written procedures, tactical considerations. When he finished, Brennan leaned back in his chair. Captain Hayes, how many snipers have we lost this month? Hayes hesitated. 7, sir. And how many convoys? 3 destroyed, 14 casualties. Brennan turned to James. I'm going to make you an offer, Cooper. Colonel Brennan stood up, walking to a map of the operational area pinned to the wall. You have 2 choices, Cooper. Option 1. I proceed with Captain Hayes's recommendation. You face court-martial, likely receive a dishonorable discharge, and spend time in military prison for disobeying direct orders. James felt his throat tighten but said nothing. Option 2, Brennan continued, turning to face him. You train a specialized unit in your technique. You prove that this hollow log hide can be systematically taught, safely executed, and effectively integrated into our operations. You turn your individual skill into a doctrine that saves lives. Hayes stood abruptly. Colonel, this is highly irregular. Brennan's voice cut through like steel. What's irregular, Captain, is losing men because we're too rigid to adapt. Cooper's method worked. 14 enemy combatants eliminated. 0 friendly casualties. Complete tactical surprise. Those are results I can't ignore. James found his voice. Sir, I'll train anyone you want. But I need command to trust the men on the ground. We know this terrain. We know what works. Brennan nodded slowly. You'll have 1 month. Train a team of 6 snipers. Show me this can be replicated. If it works, we implement it division-wide. If it fails, you face the consequences. Understood? Yes, sir. The next 4 weeks were the most intense of James's life. He selected 6 snipers from different companies, men who had hunting backgrounds, who understood patience and camouflage. He taught them how to read the jungle, how to find the perfect log, how to modify it without leaving traces, how to create multiple firing angles, and most crucially, how to extract quickly under fire. They ran drills in safe zones, then moved to contested areas. Each mission was documented, photographed, and analyzed. The results were undeniable. Enemy casualties increased while friendly casualties dropped. Supply convoys moved safely. Patrols returned intact. Captain Hayes observed every training session, his skepticism gradually giving way to reluctant respect. During one debriefing, he approached James. I was wrong, Cooper. I've spent my entire career believing the manual was gospel. But doctrine should evolve with battlefield realities. Your grandfather taught you something our military forgot, that nature itself can be the best weapon. James nodded. He taught me that the forest doesn't fight against you if you learn to become part of it. Sir. By the end of the month, Colonel Brennan called another meeting. This time, there were generals present, officers from division headquarters, even a reporter from Stars and Stripes. Brennan addressed the room. Private First Class James Cooper has developed what we're now calling the Natural Concealment Protocol. His hollow log technique has resulted in over 60 confirmed enemy eliminations across 6 different operations with 0 casualties among our sniper teams. Effective immediately, this technique is being added to our field manual and will be taught at sniper schools throughout the military. The room erupted in discussion. Hayes shook James's hand firmly. You earned this, Cooper. James felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Martinez's death wouldn't be in vain. The old ways had proven their worth. 15 years later, autumn 1983, West Virginia. James Cooper stood on the same porch where his journey had begun, watching his 8-year-old son, Michael, practice with a .22 rifle at targets set up across the property. The boy had natural talent, just like his father, just like his great-grandfather. Thomas Cooper, now 87 and moving slower but still sharp as ever, sat in his rocking chair, a blanket across his lap. That boy's got the gift, James. Just like you did. James smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. He learned from the best, Grandpa. After Vietnam, James had returned home with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a reputation that followed him. The Natural Concealment Protocol had saved countless lives throughout the remainder of the war. Military historians later credited the technique with changing how American forces approached sniper operations in jungle warfare. But the medals and recognition weren't what mattered to James. What mattered was that he'd trusted his instincts when doctrine failed. He'd honored the lessons his grandfather had taught him in these very woods. James had left the military in 1973, returned to West Virginia, and became a ranger with the National Park Service. He taught survival skills, wilderness tracking, and occasionally consulted for military training programs. The hollow log technique was now taught at Fort Benning, immortalized in field manuals, studied by soldiers who would never know the young man from West Virginia who'd risked everything to prove it worked. Captain Hayes, who had become a lifelong friend, visited twice a year. They'd hunt together, share stories, and Hayes would always joke, "You made me rewrite an entire chapter of military doctrine, Cooper. I'm still not sure if I should thank you or blame you." Sergeant Miller had retired to Florida, but they exchanged letters regularly. In his last one, Miller had written, "You taught me that sometimes the best leaders are the ones brave enough to question orders when lives are at stake. That's a lesson I carried for the rest of my career." Michael lowered his rifle and turned to his father. "Dad, Grandpa Thomas says you were a hero in the war." James walked over and knelt beside his son. "I did what I thought was right when others said it was wrong. Sometimes that's what being a soldier means. Not just following orders, but knowing when to trust what you've learned, even if it scares people." Thomas called out from his chair. "The forest teaches you everything you need to know, boy. Your father understood that. Saved a lot of lives because he remembered where he came from." As the sun set over the Appalachian Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, James felt a deep sense of peace. The hollow log hide that had once been banned, that had nearly cost him his freedom, had become his legacy. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what you thought. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this one. Real tales of courage, sacrifice, and standing up for what you believe in. And if you have suggestions for the next story, let me know in the comments. Your support means everything. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from trusting yourself when the whole world says you're wrong.